Hello, class. I hope that you are all having a good week and that it's not too crazy before Thanksgiving and you're getting plenty of time to get all those assignments done. And even though it's an unpredictable year, a weird year, that you'll get to relax over this next week. So I'll dive right in. Welcome to Parenting and Families. Here are a few of my favorite memes for you to look over that talk about parenting. Parenting is stressful. Parenting is also rewarding. Parenting is a lot of different things, but being the primary caregiver for someone is a big responsibility. Many new parents who I've talked to, when they're leaving the hospital, they're like, wait, you're letting me take this baby home? Will we have this baby and then I just take it home? You trust me? It's a big, fast adjustment, and parenting is a huge part of many people's lives. And we've talked about parents throughout this entire semester. So today we're going to dive in on parenting practices, some theories about parenting practices, and what that looks like. One of the videos you should go look at in Compass is an example of what parenting feels like on a given day with multiple kids at home. It's a mom walking throughout her house, trying to get tasks done, trying to keep track of many young children and how that feels. The video encompasses this meme where even when you go to the restroom, the kids wait for you outside, they talk to you, and it doesn't feel like you get a break. Also that putting down a sleeping baby feels more like putting down a bomb, that is not stressful. So while this is a tough experience for many people, it's also an incredible growing experience. It's an incredible personal journey, and many people find it very rewarding. So we're going to talk about those different theories today. To start off, what would socialization theory suggest on whether parenting matters? Generally, socialization is a process by which children learn the standards of behavior, attitudes, skills deemed appropriate for their society. So again, this is the definition we've been using throughout the semester, that socialization is a process we learn to function in our society. So if we want kids to be adequate adults, they have to acquire these that will enable them to function in society. And parents play a huge part in that. We tend to put socialization on parents, saying it's your responsibility to teach this to your children. So does parenting matter? It's an interesting question to start off with, because most of us would say, if we think back to our parents and what they did for us, yes, parenting really matters. You can think about the ways that your parents have played a big role in your life. Just take a minute. Think about 3 major ways your parents have played a role in your life. Now, the reason I bring this up is because this person, Harris, challenged the idea that your parents matter. What she actually did was challenge how your parents matter. This was a very controversial idea that she came up with and that many psychologists have disagreed with, and we'll talk about in depth. Harris is a psychologist who argued that parents don't matter for nurture. So parents don't matter in the environment. She argued parents, the way you parent, doesn't matter. What matters is your genes. So Harris had 2 children. One was adopted, and she raised them. She said, I raised my 2 children the exact same. My parenting practices for both kids were the exact same, and they're very different people. They must be different people then because they have very different genes. Now, many of the psychologists will tell you if we were in class, many of the other psychologists in our classroom would say, a sample size of 2 doesn't seem like the best way to base an entire book. But she actually wrote in this book, The Nurture Assumption, about many studies that she criticized or said maybe show that only the nature matters. Only the genes your parents give you matters. What they do as a parent doesn't matter after you're conceived and born. So the example I would give for this is a spin-up car versus a Hot Wheels car. So, they make those little cars that you can spin up and then you release and then they drive on their own. Harris's theory is that we're like those little spin-up cars. Our parents give us genetics, which wind up that car, and then they let it go, but they can't control where we drive after that. A lot of parenting research has focused on the opposite, which is a Hot Wheels car. Perhaps this is a car that doesn't spin up, but you have to guide throughout. You can set it on a track, but you also direct this car as it goes. And so that's a big difference between Harris and general parenting literature. So let's review her main points. She challenged the idea that the personality of adults is determined by the way their parents raised them. She said, you know what? Parents don't matter as much as peers. Your parents' importance is limited to their genetic contribution, right? So most studies in the book that she talks about failed to control for genetic influence. Control meaning take account of. These studies that she criticizes don't really take account for the genetic piece. So for example, if we are tracking aggression in children and we say, okay, we think aggressive parents may have aggressive children, she argued, well, wouldn't that be genetic? What's the evidence that that is just environmental? So she argued that parents' importance to their children's development is limited to first, that genetic contribution, and then second, to the context in which children grow. So we choose our children's context. So she said that's how parents really contribute. She says socialization is group-based. It's not based on the individual parent. It's about the group your parents choose for you. And that parents choose their friends, and that in turn chooses their kids' friends. Is that the parents form a group where they're usually very similar people, and that chooses the child's group where they are also going to be similar people. So for example, if parents happen to be friends, you might even be able to think of someone that your parents are very, very good friends with, and you became with their children. And so generally, she said, group processes are critical in ontogeny and phylogeny, which are basically saying that evolution, development, diversification of individual organisms. She concluded that the parenting industry serves a great demand, but no purpose. So we have all these things. Parents want to be the best they can. They want to learn. So we have parenting books. We have specific toys. Buy the right toy for your child. There's so many advertisements around Christmas time saying this is the right toy to buy for your kid. This is the trending toy that will make them cool. That you can improve in your parenting practices. You should do things differently. It's a huge industry, but there's no purpose to it. That what you gave your child genetically is what matters, and the parenting practices you have do not. So let's look at an example of this group socialization theory of Harris's. She presents two views in her writing. The first view represents the traditional model of how children acquire cultural knowledge. Both of these are specifically referring to cultural knowledge. So in view one, which was not Harris's, children acquire cultural knowledge from many different sources, and that knowledge is transmitted on an individual to individual basis. So for example, this child has the influence of mother, father, teacher, and peer. So in a given day, perhaps the child drives to school with their mother and they have an experience there that socializes them. And then they go to school, and in school, the practices and expectations of the teacher in the classroom impact that student. And if they're sitting next to a friend and get to talk to their friend, that peer influences them. And then if their father picks them up home from school, perhaps they have a conversation that influences them that way too. So this fits with the model we were looking at, Bronfenbrenner's model, in the first lecture. The idea that this is the kid's immediate sphere of influence, and these are the people who are impacting their development. Harris argued for the second view in this, that the transmission of socialization, of cultural knowledge, happens from group to group. So her theory was that parents first influence each other. Parents choose their friend group. She argues this by saying, for instance, caregivers of the same social class, ethnic group, and neighborhood may have more similar parenting practices than they actually have with their parents. So the people you choose now is that idea of like friends or the family you choose in this context. So you might be closer to your friends' parenting styles than your parents' parenting styles. All right. So in this way, parents influence each other. I know some parents who in town here in Champaign-Urbana where one family, every birthday for their kids, they put up posters all over the house with funny rhymes, with little jokes, with songs, just to celebrate the child's birthday. They have some really good friends who said, wow, we love that idea. We're going to do that too. So now both these families put up birthday signs on their kid's birthday. So you see the families influencing each other, essentially in this. And then it says, because the parents are influencing each other, that group of parents, that pod, the language we're all using for our little social groups during COVID, impacts the pod of children in that child group. Okay, so the practices of that general group impact that group of children. This would be really interesting to study during COVID when we are saying, a lot of families are saying, we're gonna only be social with these families. So you're actually getting these really clear groups, even more distinct than before. So in this way, parents influence each other, and that impacts the group of children that they in turn influence. And Harris did recognize the role of the teacher in this association as well. As you see right here, they said, okay, the teacher influences these groups of children because they're in classrooms. So the big argument that Harris makes is that if you keep kids in the same group, you could switch the parents out. So if I'm in a group with my friends' parents, it doesn't matter if I have my parents or my friends' parents. They could switch and all be exactly the same because that subculture stays the same. So if we left kids in their homes or their schools in their neighborhood, but switched out their parents in that group, it wouldn't matter because the parents are so similar across that context. So personally, I find this really challenging. My parents are people I point to who I think you've had a significant influence in my life, which I really value. But there is actually evidence to back up some of her claims. There is evidence to say, oh, okay, maybe genes matter more than we were thinking. This has a long history. This is an example from 57, which talked about a similar idea. There's a long history of saying, well, maybe parents matter because of their genes. So that's the disappointing conclusion, is there is some evidence to support her theory. So pause this video and go watch the next video from Steven Pinker. This is the video. Click on this link. The one on Compass is being weird, so just make sure you click on this actual link either in Compass or here to watch his description of this. Steven Pinker essentially loves Harris's work and says, yeah, I agree with this. I think this is correct. So even though there's evidence for her perspective and we can say, okay, there is some stuff to back this up, and developmental psychologists are starting to say, wow, okay, there is merit to her points, there are some weaknesses to her point as well that we're going to review really quickly. First is that she had a limited literature review. So when researchers go and say, I want to investigate a problem, they always look over past research that has occurred. She did this in a very, very narrow way that seemed to more fit her aim. So people said, you need to review the literature more broadly and a little less bias to really be able to make these claims. The second issue people really had with her work were that they had issues with her use and interpretation of behavioral genetics data. So she was looking at this past research and data on behavior and how it relates to genetics, but she interpreted it in a really narrow way. And that did impact her being able to make a strong claim like this. And then finally, people criticized her for omitting that parents can affect peer involvement. So I don't know about you guys, but we know that when teenagers become teenagers, peers become more important than parents. But parents still play a significant role in who your friends are. For example, some parents encourage their kids to hang out with certain friends. because they think they're a good influence during that time. They might say, hey, this person is a good student, they're athletic, they're XYZ, they're popular, whatever. Hang out with this person. I'm going to encourage my kid to hang out with this person. You also have parents helping you navigate complicated friend situations. I cannot tell you how many times I sat in the car with my mom and we talked through complicated social situations in middle school where, hey, this person said this, how should I react? What should I do? What do you think they meant? And she not only acted as a sounding board, she helped me, work through those and think about what they meant and think about what's a healthy way for me to respond. So here you see my mom playing a significant role in my development and my ability to make friends in middle school. And so Harris didn't really account for the fact that parents are always involved in this, or oftentimes. Not all parents get involved, but parents can be involved in peer relationships to some level beyond simply the genetic piece of it all. So we're going to take a look at some of the counter arguments for these points in the remainder of this class. So we're acknowledging Harris's work and saying she has some very good points, but there's more to it than that. There are some environmental pieces, and we want to look at the literature on those ideas. Pause the video and go watch this. It's a fantastic Portlandia video about different parenting practices and styles and the pressure parents feel to try these different parenting styles. It's a good lead into what we'll talk about next. So pause this, go watch that. So beyond Harris's work, there's one model of parenting that has been used very, very, very widely that describes these 4 parenting styles. This has been used for years. It is still used to this day. It's one of the major ways people look at parenting. So sort of similar to the identity status model, they have 2 continuums. This continuum is responsiveness, warmth, and supportiveness. So this is how warm are your parents to you? How supportive are they? Do they respond to your needs as a child? When you're a preschooler and perhaps you come home crying, do they respond to you or do they not? Are they warm to you? Do they show affection to you? And then are they supportive of what you want to do? If you want to say, hey, I want to try out for this sports team, or I want to go for this scholarship, or I want to go to this college, are they supportive of you across that process? So it goes from low responsiveness, warmth, and supportiveness to high. On the other one, you have behavioral control and demandingness. So on this scale, it's how much do your parents try to control you? If you say, as a teenager, I'm going to go to this party with friends, do they try to control that behavior? Do they not try to control that behavior? And then how demanding are they? Did they demand you get certain grades or do chores or behave a certain way in public, or did they not do that? So it was higher or lower on control, and then higher and lower on responsiveness to you and support. From this, the theory came up with 4 different styles. And you can watch a video representing each of these styles on the Compass page. So as I talk about these, I would encourage you to go watch. They're 1 minute long each. These very short examples of these different parenting styles. They're a great illustration for what these encompass. So first, you have permissive parenting. Permissive parenting, you can see, is parents who are low in their control and demandingness and high in their warmth and supportiveness. So this is things like, there are no guidelines. I love you. There's no guidelines. They're very lenient if somebody breaks the rules. They are likely to overindulge or spoil their children. Like, I'm going to give you many gifts. I'm going to do whatever you want. It's okay if you break the rules. They're not directive. And it might lead to some blurred roles. So guys, I love the show Gilmore Girls. It's a good early 2000s show. It is so fun that the fashion in that show is early 2000s and we're seeing how ridiculous it looks now. But the relationship centers on a mother and daughter who are only 16 years apart because the mother had her when she was 16 years old. And they operate first as friends, second as mother and daughter. And so it goes between their relationship, which is really cool and fun for the show. But in real life, having blurred roles between parent and child is not related to positive outcomes. Having a parent you can rely on and who also has that control is usually more positive. And they might also say, you're the boss. Next, you have uninvolved parenting. So these are parents who are low on control and demandingness and also low on responsiveness and supportiveness. So these are parents who are distant. They might even be uninterested in their kids, what they're doing, don't even know what their kids are involved in and don't want to learn what they're involved in, who may not talk to their kids. These are parents who are very passive. They just kind of let probably no curfew. They don't know about their kids' lives. They just let them live on their own, or they're even absent from their lives. They aren't a part of their lives. And in extreme cases, this would be neglect. This is, I'm not taking care of you. I'm not responding to your needs. So in extreme cases, this is where we see neglectful behavior. There are a lot of examples of this in literature focused on kids who act out because they have uninvolved parents who don't do anything. So again, The Breakfast Club is actually a really good example of all 4 of these different styles of parenting. That movie is amazing. Okay, so next you have authoritarian, which is high on control and low on that warmth and responsiveness. So these are parents who might punish their kids more, say you did something wrong, so I'm going to punish you for that, regardless of what happens. This is an emphasis on rules and structure. This is very direct. The phrase, I'm the boss because I said so, you don't need to understand. You need to do what I say. A high focus on obedience and status. And this is usually parents who are very, very rigid, saying this is the way it is. And then next, you get to authoritative parenting, which is high on warmth and supportiveness and high on that behavioral control and demandingness. So these are parents who have standards, but they are flexible. This might be a parent when a kid comes home after curfew, who instead of punishing them or saying it's okay, they punish them and say, I want to understand why. Let's talk about it. You have more of a democratic system of like, well, why did you misbehave? Or for instance, if kids do something wrong, like steal a cookie, talking to them about why that's wrong and what to do next time. So you see more of a close monitoring of kids. You see a warm type of encouraging their growth. I can't remember the phrase. What's the name? There's a name, though, for the idea that you're helping kids along the way to success. I've used the example in the past and I'm driving me crazy. I can't remember it. But the idea that you're helping kids learn the guidelines and learn the rules while you're demanding a lot of them, it's providing a lot of structure for kids and a lot of warmth at the same time. So we usually link this to self-regulation. This was created years and years and years ago. It's a really good example with some caveats. So when we're researchers, we might research an idea from a given perspective. We might say, I think that authoritarian parenting is bad, which essentially this study said authoritarian is a bad parenting style. They said authoritative is the best, uninvolved and permissive aren't great, and authoritarian parenting is also bad. The problem with this is that they used an incredibly biased sample to do this research originally. So while these 4 styles exist, they measured this in primarily middle class white samples, mostly white samples. And we applied it as scientists to other groups regularly. And what they found was that this didn't actually always reflect the best parenting styles. Over the past couple of years, there's been some really cool findings using this model saying we need to rethink how we frame what is good and what is bad in these parenting styles, because there's emerging research that particularly minoritized youth in the United States who have authoritarian parents, in some instances, actually have better outcomes. And they say sometimes this parenting style is really positive. So keep this model in mind for context. And if you're interested in parenting and writing an extra credit paper about parenting, I would highly recommend looking into some of those newer articles about this measure too. This is a little vignette of some of the interviews and stuff that went into these parenting styles. Here's the researcher, one of the researchers who did this. So they said, okay, parents of children who were discontent, withdrawn, and distrustful, the parents themselves were detached, controlling, and somewhat less warm than other parents. Parents of children who are more self-reliant, self-controlled, explorative, and content had parents who were a combination of these things. So they seem to find that parents reflected their children's perspective, and they found these trends in parenting related to these different parenting styles. So generally, the goal of parenting, if we were to very broadly summarize it, obviously this needs to be contextually based, but is that parenting is about teaching right from wrong so that children can grow up to be well-adjusted and self-regulated adults. So at the core of all this parenting stuff is discipline. What types of disciplinary practices do parents use? And how is that a defining feature of how kids are reared? And does that matter for how they develop? So think for a second, how do your parents discipline you? What did that look like? Was it positive or negative? Did they ever change their disciplinary practices when you grew up? Did they discipline you the same way when you were younger as they did when you were older? I think an interesting question is, which disciplinary practice is the most effective? What was the most effective for you when you were growing up? So the use of these different disciplinary styles, the researchers found, is influenced by many different factors, including parents' beliefs and cultural background, child's age and characteristics, and many, many other factors. So a lot goes into parenting practices and how that influences child's adjustment. So pause the video, read through this. This is a general historical perspective on this idea of how do parenting disciplinary practices influence children. So generally, what it says is that past research on discipline and maternal coldness is related to child outcomes, positive and negative. So research for a long time has focused on the good and bad disciplinary practices and how these influence children. So this is one study looking at this across time, looking at the x-axis, you have age. So the kids were 1-year-old, 2-year-old, 3-year-old, or 4-year-olds. And then it looked at their PRCM score, which is parental response to child misbehavior. So this is parents filling out a survey about how they responded to kids' misbehavior. And then each of these lines represents a different behavior. So essentially what you're getting here is, how did you discipline your child at different ages across time? So for instance, with reasoning with them, saying, okay, if they stole a cookie, reason with them, if you steal a cookie, you won't have one later, things like that. And you see that in this line, they probably use this about 4 times a week, or 5 to 6 times. So here you have 0 is never, 1 is less than 1 time a week, 2 is 1 to 2 times a week, 3 is 3 to 4, 4 is 5 to 6. So it increases, but about 5 to 6 times per week. Man, that's a confusing metric. Parents reasoned with their kids. And then you have yelling. So yelling is the little circle one that goes right here. So you see the yelling increases as kids grow a little bit. Then giving them a timeout significantly increases to 3 years old, but then backs off around 4 years old. And then the last one, spank them with your hand, seems to stay about the same and slightly drop off at 4 years old. But that stays pretty consistent. We're looking at about 1 time per week. They're using most of these. So you see reason being used the most and increasing, but a variety of these other ones, more like 1 to 2 times a week. what would be interesting for me is to see the relationship between these two. Because if reason doesn't work, then parents might switch to timeout. And if timeout doesn't work, maybe they'll switch to yelling. And then maybe they'll switch to slapping their hand. So parents don't necessarily use one practice consistently, especially if it doesn't work. I know in the case of my growing up, there were a few times that, something like a timeout didn't work. So my parents had to try something different. So this study, Jackson 2012, looked at, does education predict corporal punishment? Corporal punishment being physical discipline. And they were interested in the role of authoritarian attitudes in this. So remember, we talked about authoritarian, high control, low warmth, and if that's impacts this. And they were also interested in, do parents endorse corporal punishment? Do they say, yes, corporal punishment is a good thing? So essentially their question was, if you're more or less educated, does it impact how you view corporal punishment if you're an authoritarian parent, and your actual use of corporal punishment? So every line is a significant relationship. So education was significantly related to less use of corporal punishment. So the more educated parents were, the less they used corporal punishment. Similarly, the more education they had, the less they endorsed corporal punishment. So what that says is that if you're more educated, you don't endorse physical discipline as much. And they found that however much you endorse corporal punishment, it's also related to using that. So if you endorse it, you're more likely to use it. The interesting thing about this model is that more education was linked to lower authoritarian attitudes, less authoritarian parenting, but authoritarian attitudes was not significantly related to endorsing corporal punishment or using corporal punishment. And that's one of the main things this theory has argued, is that authoritarian parents are more likely to use physical discipline. So in this study, it's not significantly related to endorsing or using corporal punishment. So we've talked about it a little bit. Let's discuss culture in this association. Okay, so is physical discipline always associated with maladjustment? Let's look at social learning theory and cultural normativeness. So again, social learning theory is the idea that new behaviors can be acquired by observing or imitating others. So kids, an example of this is that kids tend to adopt their parents' sayings. Any teachers who are watching this will know exactly what I'm talking about. So my partner is a goofball. He's very, very goofy. And when we go and hang out with our friends who have young kids, there's a lot of times when the parents are like, oh, John, what are you doing? Because he's just very, very goofy. And one day we were hanging out at their house and John did something funny. And the 5-year-old in the family, so 5 years old, this little kid goes, huh, John. Sounded exactly like his mom, the exact way his mom said it. And it was so funny. I just died laughing because the son learned this behavior from his mother, that she always goes, John. So perhaps this matters for physical discipline. So if kids observe their parents giving out physical discipline, are they more likely to say it's okay? Are they more likely to give out physical discipline? And then we can look at cultural normativeness. Culture consists of a set of norms. And does that apply to physical discipline? If it's a cultural norm for your moms to spank you, does that mean it seems more normal to you as a person? And do kids perceive it the same way? So there's also this difference between how kids perceive cultural normativeness and the reality of it. So perhaps if you live in a small bubble, if your parents physically discipline you, it seems normal, and that's your perception of your culture, but the reality is it's not normal in your culture. And so Lansford wanted to study this and look by interviewing mothers and their children, and they wanted to look across context. So this is their hypothesized model. This is not what they found. This was their hypothesis, was that here we have the frequency of discipline use being no use at all to very much. And then looking at kids' adjustment problems to very low to a lot of adjustment problems. Their theory was that whether people thought it was normal to engage in physical discipline was linked to how much parents use physical discipline and children's adjustment over time. So for kids and parents who perceive physical discipline as normal, the frequency of discipline is not going to matter. They hypothesize, though, that in societies where parents and kids don't see physical discipline as normal, we're gonna see a big difference in adjustment, where if they don't use very much physical discipline, they have low adjustment difficulties. And if parents are using a lot of physical discipline, we're gonna see high adjustment difficulties. So they measured 336 mother-child dyads. So we're actually talking about like 600 kids across 6 cultures: China, India, Italy, Kenya, Philippines, and Thailand. They generally worked with middle-class families within the country, within the context of that country. Then they did discipline interviews with the mother and child, asking them specifically about spanking, slapping, grabbing, shaking, and beating up. And they asked moms about their own use of physical discipline and others' use of physical discipline. So they said, how much do you physically discipline your kid in these ways? How much do others physically discipline their kids in these ways? They used the child behavior checklist and youth self-reports to look at their own adjustment. So what did they find? These models, here you see the different countries, bar plots of the different countries. Here you see mothers' use of physical discipline. So for instance, in India, mothers' use of physical discipline was slightly higher than Italy, but slightly lower than Kenya. So you look across those contexts. And then this one is mothers' perception of other parents' use of physical discipline. So mothers, this is how they measured perceived cultural normativeness. They asked mothers, how much do other parents use physical discipline to discipline their children? And you see some interesting differences here. So in Italy, mothers don't report as much physical use of physical discipline, but they perceive there's a lot more. And in contrast, in China, they perceive that fewer people use physical discipline than how they use physical discipline. And then this is a report of children's perceived cultural normativeness. So children's perceptions of other parents' use of physical discipline. And so you can see it's kind of similar to parents. It's a little bit different in some cases, like China, big difference in the Philippines. So take a second to pause the video and review those findings a bit more. Do children's and mothers' perceptions of others' use of physical discipline matter? That's what the next question tests, and essentially yes. Okay, let's look at some charts on this finding. So these are a little complicated, so I'm going to walk through them first. You have use of physical discipline low to high across graphs. They drew 2 separate lines for low normativeness, being it's not normal to use physical discipline, and high norm to say it is normal to use physical discipline. And then on the y-axis, they measured an adjustment outcome. So they focused on anxiety and aggression. And then so this first graph, they looked at mother-reported normativeness. Okay, so they said how the mothers reported on normativeness as low or high. And they found when mothers said that physical discipline was normal, was very, very normal, they had less of directionality in that physical discipline. But when they said it wasn't normal, there was much more. So what this means is that in societies where mothers say, oh, it's really normal to discipline your children, there's not as much variation in child outcomes based on that physical discipline. But if it's low normative, there is a big difference. These are the findings for child-reported normatives. So when they ask the kids, is it normal? How much do other parents physically discipline their children? You find a similar line of results. where the line is more dramatic in places where it's not seen as normal. And then finally, you see here where aggression was significantly higher among places where it was just more normal, but you still see more directionality in that low perceived normativeness. Now, across the entire sample, they did find that use of physical discipline predicted aggression and anxiety, regardless. Like if you use more, it's linked to more anxiety and aggression, regardless of perceived normativeness. But this just goes into that relationship, looking at how normal do people think it is. So this is another example of it. So what they concluded from this study was that mother's use of physical discipline and child adjustment, the relationship between those two was moderated by perceived normativeness. And then generally, like I said, more physical discipline was really related to more negative outcomes, higher anxiety, higher aggression, things like that. So thinking about Harris's example of parents, let's talk about parent directing, which we touched on earlier. So parent directing essentially are parents' efforts to guide their children's peer relationships. Okay, so this is parents trying to say, hang out with these people, maybe not with these people, trying to just control that aspect or direct kids in a certain direction. Is this beneficial or harmful? Some studies have found that parental directing is associated with positive peer adjustment outcomes. So sometimes this is good. Sometimes kids are shy and their parents saying, hey, you need to ask these people to hang out is a really, really positive thing. Other times though, sometimes this can be not as helpful. Sometimes this can be harmful because sometimes parents push their kids towards hanging out with worse peer groups, more dangerous peer groups. Other times they may direct their kids towards not hanging out with people. Some parents say, hang out with me, you don't need friends, things like that. They might try to direct them away from other people. Remember when we were talking about identity development, specifically identity foreclosure, that some kids, their parents may say, this is who you are, this is who you need to be friends with, and that's how it goes. So again, this could be beneficial or harmful. So let's look into this a little bit more. So 2 wanted to study this relationship in the context of stress reactivity, which is basically, do people have a higher or lower awareness and stress response to circumstances? So you might have something where a friend says something ambiguous that might be taken as good or bad. Some people with low reactiveness are going to be like, whatever, I don't care, I don't know what it means. Other people are going to be really respond to that and be like, I don't know what they mean. What could they mean? I'm stressed out. I'm nervous. Let me talk to my friends and figure it out. So what 2 was wondering was, if parents are directing these kids, does that matter based on how reactive they are to that feedback? So being low reactivity may lead to under arousal, and that people are kind of insensitive to those cues. Yeah, I don't react to them. It's fine. Whatever, they can say what they want. So generally we see this as fearlessness, sensation seeking, and low behavioral inhibition. These people are less likely to change their behavior. So this is a lower concern for making a positive impression, maybe less motivation to engage in positive behaviors. Generally, we find that low reactivity is linked to higher aggression and poorer social outcomes. Now, if you're higher reactive, it may reflect individuals who are cognitively engaged in the social situation, who say, yes, I'm really reacting to this. So it's marked by a greater desire to make a positive impression on your peers. You want to make a good impression. You care what they think. So in peer stress, it may reflect a greater level of awareness and engagement in the social interaction. So you're really, really focusing and thinking about what's happening in this social interaction. This has been linked to higher friendship quality and more positive social skills. So perhaps since you're paying more attention and it matters more to you, you have higher skills, you've developed those over time, and you have closer friendships. So what they really wanted to look at is, do some children benefit more from parenting directing than others? Are they more salient? Are they going to react to that more? Okay, so what they found was that they looked at parent directing as like, this is the middle. So then the mean of parent directing, parents who gave less directing versus parents who gave more directing. And then they looked at friendship quality. So how high quality were their friendships? And what they found was that kids who had higher reactivity experienced pretty much the same friendship quality across parent directing. But kids who had that lower reactivity, parenting directing mattered. It predicted their friendship quality. So parents who were taking that role and their kids weren't as reactive, it was really important. And it could help protect against some of the negative outcomes for these lower reactivity peers. And a similar line of results here. This is positive peer affiliations. How many people did they say they were friends with who said they're friends with back? And it was higher for lower reactive kids who had a lot of parent directing. So here you see direct competition to what Harris was saying. They looked at genetics. They looked at reactivity. Parent directing, according to Harris, shouldn't matter, but it does for these kids. So two concluded that parental directing can benefit adolescent peer adjustment by the way it's done and their individual characteristics. So it matters in context. So parents seem to matter for some adolescents, maybe not for others, but parents do appear to have some influence on their kids. So we can comfortably say that adolescent adjustment derives in part from environmental experiences like family dynamics. In fact, when we have maladaptive family dynamics, that may train kids to have negative interaction with individuals outside the family. A great example of this is fighting with someone you're in a relationship with. All of us have different ways of dealing with conflict. Some people are avoidant. Some people are passive aggressive versus people who are confrontational to people who are straight up bullies. You have all these different styles. Say your family has a very different type of conflict style than your partner. It's going to be hard to figure that out sometimes. You're going to have to really communicate well. If you're an avoidant person, but your partner is confrontational, when you try it, they'll try to keep fighting with you or saying, hey, let's deal with this, let's talk about it, and you'll be avoiding it. And that's something most couples have to go through and figure out. So if your family has maladaptive ways of dealing with conflict, then that'll train you for how you should interact with your peers and your future romantic partners. You can also see in general that bullying is significantly predicts increased substance use. And these type of environmental factors influence how you interact with your family and your outcomes. So we see these in big environmental things that also influence how kids develop. So it can't all be genetics. So in general, family violence provides a salient context from which we can understand the links between peer aggression and substance use. What's happening in your family influences both of these things. And so we have some examples there in bullying and fighting. This tends to predict substance use among males, but not females, which is interesting. There's a lot of contextual factors that goes into that, potentially culture, what we value. The gender lecture was last week talking about how we socialize men and women differently, males and females differently. But all right, that's the conclusion of our parenting lecture. I hope that you guys have a great week and then a great Thanksgiving break.